It's important as we begin discussing Christianity and other world religions that we remember our purpose for doing so. As we've seen from the beginning of civilization, religious beliefs impact culture, and culture impacts religious beliefs. Remember how the Neolithic and Paleolithic people created religious beliefs to make sense of the things that they just simply didn't have explanations for? That's an example of culture impacting religious beliefs. When the Jews wrote laws based on the morals that they developed from trying to live an obedient life that would make their God happy, they were basing their culture on their religious beliefs. Religion and culture are so entwined that it's really hard to separate the two, and that's why we discuss it in history. Another trend that we tend to see throughout history in terms of religious development is that we see past cultures have turned toward religion when times are bad, when people are searching for some kind of fulfillment. That's actually what was going on in Rome in the last centuries of the falling Roman Empire as Christianity was evolving there. Christianity gave civilization the hope of individual immortality. Today, Judaism has varying views on immortality. Is there a proper place that souls go, or is it metaphorical? Is it more important to live a full and giving life on earth and then just be at peace with death because it means all your work on earth is done? There was no question about Christianity, and its promise of immortality broke with classical antiquity. So let's get started talking about Christianity as an early world religion. And here's your handy-dandy timetable that's always part of your slides. This one covers a period of about 500 years, starting with the crucifixion of Jesus and ending with the rules of Saint Benedict and his founding of monasticism. In the 1st century BC, Judaism was dominated by 4 sects or groups: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the Zealots. It's important to have a foundational understanding of each one of these so we can examine the entrance of Jesus into the mix. First, the Sadducees. They were religiously conservative and primary influential landowners and priests. They controlled the temple in Jerusalem and demanded a very strict adherence to and interpretation of Mosaic law, which are the laws of Moses, and the Torah, which is the law of God as revealed to Moses in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. The Sadducees were very focused on the temple too, and the kinds of rituals or ceremonies that would happen there. They did not believe in the afterlife. Instead, they believed that God handed out rewards and punishments to the living. You didn't have to wait until death for that. The Pharisees were more flexible than the strict Sadducees. They promoted discussion of Mosaic law and even allowed for interpretation of it. For them, it just wasn't as cut and dry as it was for the Sadducees. The Pharisees also considered a degree of oral tradition. That's information passed from one generation to another, in addition to the written word from the Torah. The Pharisees were the largest Jewish sect and the one that Judaism continued to develop from. They did believe in an afterlife, although the concept of immortality is barely discussed in the Hebrew Scriptures. By the time of Jesus, the idea of immortality and an afterlife, though, was growing in popularity. The Essenes developed a semi-monastic order, which just means that they created a type of communal religious order where their focus was on serving God, doing godly works like charity, or studying His Word. Their community was near the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea Scrolls, found in 1947, were discovered near the Essenes community of Qumran. These scrolls are made of leather and date back to a period between 200 BC to 66 to about 70 AD. They're the oldest Hebrew manuscripts and are specifically unique to the Essenes sect. From them, researchers have been able to find parallels between the Qumran community and the Jesus movement, although there is no mention specifically of Jesus in these scrolls. One thing they shared in common with Jesus was their preaching of the end days. The Essenes believed the end was imminent. The Zealots were the 4th Jewish sect, Zealots with a capital Z. When we use the word zealot today with the lowercase z, we're usually talking about someone who's fanatical about a passion or a religious or political belief. The same could be said of the Jewish zealot sect, but maybe they weren't exactly fanatical as such, but they were seen as radical. The zealots demanded that the Jews not recognize the Roman emperor as their authority because their authority should be God. And that also included not paying taxes to the emperor, so you can see how that could be a problem for Rome. The zealots did engage in acts of resistance against Rome, and remember, at this particular time, the Romans were mostly pagan. I already mentioned that the Pharisees believed in the concept of an afterlife. In the 1st century BC, the concept of a Messiah was also gaining ground. This Messiah would be chosen by God to redeem and liberate Israel from foreign rule, which would then lead to the Jews being blessed with peace and prosperity. At that point, then, the Messiah would rule instead of the Roman emperor. Jesus preached his messages as a Jew. Mary and Joseph were Jews. He lived in Jewish culture. Jesus, who we date to living from about 4 BC to 29 AD, was a Jew. Since we know he was a Jew, we have a tendency to want to place him into one of those 4 Jewish sects, but it's really not possible. Some say that because his earthly parents were peasants, that they would not have belonged in a formal way to a sect. Others point out that because Jesus, in his later life, was preaching new things, like a personal relationship for each individual with God, the afterlife, or the idea that he was the Messiah, would also not make it possible to connect him with one of those sects. But what we do know is that Jesus preached moral transformation of the individual based on ethics that were the core of Mosaic law. He was really distressed by Judaism of his day. He felt like the strict adherence to the law and to those rituals were overshadowing the importance of prophetic value, which Jesus saw as this very center of Jewish religion. The leaders saw their rituals as things that they needed to do to keep their covenant and to sanctify humanity. To Jesus, these rules dealt with humanity's visible behavior, and he felt like they should focus more on their moral behavior. I think the best way to explain this is a church sign that I drove by one day. It said, "It's not what you do when someone is looking, it's what you do when you think no one is looking." So today, with the hindsight we have and the culture of today, it's easier for us to understand Jesus' point. But in his day, to the Jewish leaders, he was some sort of radical who thought he was above the law, which was blasphemy. To the Roman rulers of Palestine, Jesus was a political agitator who might start a revolt against Rome. The Jewish leaders turned Jesus over to the Roman authorities, which is when Pontius Pilate sentenced him to death by crucifixion, which was the punishment for someone guilty of high treason. Plus, Pilate wanted to eliminate the leader of this growing group before he could start an uprising against Rome. Jesus had become that popular. But at his death, Christianity was just a small Jewish sect. His followers had grown, but his base was the 12 disciples. What spread Christianity as a movement and made his small group of believers even more convinced was their belief that Jesus was resurrected on the 3rd day after his burial. This allowed them to see him as divine, a Savior who had lived on earth to show people the way to heaven. At the time, Jesus became the center of the development of the emerging Christian church. We don't have any documented proof that Jesus wanted to start a new church, and there wasn't immediately a Christian church separate from Judaism. Instead, it was more like another Jewish sect. In order to spread the new religion, it had to become separate from Jewish culture, ritual, politics, which is where St. Paul comes into play, and he began his work to take Christianity from a sect to a world religion. St. Paul, formerly known as Saul, was from the Greek city of Tarsus, which would have made him a Hellenized Jew. Paul lived from about 5 AD to 67 AD, and he recognized that the Christian message really applied to non-Jews as well. So he began preaching to the Gentiles, or the non-Jews. He traveled as a missionary throughout the Roman Empire. In order to make the religion global and to separate it from Judaism, Paul taught that no one was bound by the rituals of Judaism. He also taught that Jesus was the Messiah that the Jews had been waiting for, and that his crucifixion superseded Mosaic law, that his crucifixion outweighed Mosaic law. Paul saw Christianity not as the religion of a nation, but as a global community. As I mentioned on the last slide, Paul's decision to distance Christianity from Judaism really helped spread Christianity by making it seem more open and welcoming to everyone, to the masses. But it was slow growing. It didn't really take firm root until the 2nd century. But in the 3rd century, it grew substantially and even became the official religion of the Roman Empire by the end of the 4th century. One of the reasons it took hold when it did is that it offered comfort. Remember, the fall of the Roman Empire was in 395, which is near the end of the 4th century. During times of defeat or suffering, Christianity offered hope. The typical Greek and Roman cultures valued reason and self-reliance and didn't provide for emotional needs like Christianity did. Bottom line, people needed hope at this particular time. Christianity gave hope and dignity to the people of the Greco-Roman civilization that would not have otherwise had much in life to look forward to. The idea that a universal father cared for them and that a brother died for them gave these people the self-worth that the government system had not given them before. Another key feature of the growing universality of Christianity was its ability or willingness to assimilate some elements from Greek philosophy or other elements from mystery religions into it. For instance, by bringing in elements from philosophy, Christianity was able to attract those people who were more into intellect than religion, more into science instead of emotion or faith. Greek philosophy had to give up some of its focus on free thinking in order to accept Christian revelation. But some elements of Christianity coincided with elements of the mystery or mythic religions, which made it at least familiar to them. So it wasn't such a distant idea, this whole new Christianity thing. Like, for instance, December 25th was the birth date of the god Mithras, and there were other holy days, communion and such, that kind of fell into place in common time periods so that they could kind of adjust and make those fit. The virgin birth also is a story that's shared throughout ancient cultures, predating the story of Jesus' birth. Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome, were supposedly born of a virgin, and in Egypt, Horus was born to the virgin Isis. Zoroaster, who we talked about too in chapter 2, maybe even chapter 1, as the founder of Zoroastrianism, his mother was said to be a virgin. So we have these virgin birth stories that precede Jesus' birth. At first, the Roman government didn't give much thought to this religious thinking that's floating around. Rome was the perfect place to grow a new religion. It was known for its universalism, which means that it accepted people of all nationalities, which gave them many cultures. Many of those people there spoke Greek, which made it easier to spread the word of Christianity, because if they'd all spoken different languages, it stands to reason that Christianity would have taken longer to share, especially by Hellenized Jews, who were speaking Greek. But as Christianity grew, the Roman government began to fear that Christians might try to overthrow their authority. They were seen as disloyal citizens because they taught to give allegiance to God, not the nation. The Christians were not partaking of typical Roman life. They weren't going to the gladiator fights because they frowned on violence. They weren't paying homage to their dead ancestors because that was kind of false idolatry. They were basically followers of a criminal who had been crucified for his crimes, according to the Romans. The Romans then began blaming the Christians for things that were wrong in their society, like problems with plagues or family problems or military losses. All of these things, they said, were the fault of the Christians for not honoring their ancestral gods and traditions. Some emperors even began persecuting Christians. Some were burned alive or beheaded, imprisoned or beaten or ripped to shreds by hungry animals in those very gladiator arenas that they thought was just too violent to go to. Ironically, this persecution actually drew in more Christian converts. They were amazed by the courage that they saw of these new people, these Christians, that they were willing to die for their faith. Since the Romans couldn't crush the movement, they finally began to accept it with the Edict of Milan in 313 that granted religious tolerance to the Christians. Emperor Constantine was the one who signed it, and later he was even baptized as a Christian himself. By 392, Emperor Theodosius I made Christianity the state religion of the empire. With Christians now officially in power, persecution didn't end, it just switched to other people, like pagans and Jews, or other Christians who didn't have orthodox views. Throughout church history, there was a hierarchy. The people who had the authority to preside over Mass or issue communion were known as priests or bishops. The Bishop of Rome, who we know today as the Pope, had superiority over the other bishops. They chose Rome because of a New Testament passage in Matthew 16 and 18 in which Jesus tells Peter, whose given name was Simon, "Upon this rock I will build my church." And he says that Peter is the rock of the church. Peter actually means rock in Greek. So they take it that Jesus intended for Peter to take over the church in his absence. And since Peter had built a church in Rome, this was seen as the place where Peter built Jesus' church. The development of monasticism came out of concern about society's worldliness, including some corrupt clergy. Some Christians took to the mountains or forests to hide in contemplation of living a worthy life. Some took it a step farther and went to extremes to suffer in God's name, like by wearing spiked corsets to inflict pain, or to eat a diet of only herbs for a long period of time, or by sitting on a pillar for a long time. As more people sought to get closer to God, the idea of monasticism spread. When we talk about monasticism, we're referring to the practice of living a life dedicated to worship and study of God that relies on living by rules that are often stricter than those of other people. Saint Benedict developed an order based on living a life of poverty, study, and obedience. They prayed a lot, but talked to each other very little, and they worked hard in their communal living arrangement. His rule became the standard for monasteries across Western Europe. As you can imagine, Christian teachings came under a great deal of scrutiny, largely because of the time frame in which the works were written. Paul wrote his 25 to 30 years after Jesus' crucifixion. About 40 years after his death, Mark recorded Jesus' sayings from oral histories. Matthew and Luke used Mark's account to write longer Gospels. John wrote his Gospel in about 110 AD. All in all, there are 27 books in the Christian New Testament, and they also accepted the Old Testament of the Hebrews as God's Word. Early Christians did not read their own Bible. They relied on clergy to teach them its meanings, but it could be interpreted differently, so debate began over interpretations as well. The biggest controversy was over how people viewed the relationship between God and Jesus. Arius said that Jesus was not completely divine if he was born of a human mother. That kind of throws this monkey wrench into church doctrine, which taught that Jesus was co-equal and co-eternal with God, his Father. Constantine I, who made the way for Christian tolerance to begin with, called the first meeting of bishops to address this concern in the Council of Nicaea in 325. At that meeting, the bishops declared God and Jesus were indeed co-eternal and co-equal. That meant that Arius and his followers, who believed otherwise, were officially heretics. Just on a side note, Arius and his followers were known as Arians, but that's not the same kind of Aryans we associate today with white supremacy. Christians, then, just as now, had to balance their beliefs with the secular world. At first, many Christians refused acts of war or revenge because it conflicted with their nonviolent values. Others thought that they had to protect their Christian beliefs by fighting in order to defend Christianity. After the Roman emperors accepted Christianity, there were Christians who began serving in the government more often, and they began to see that with pending attacks of barbarians, they couldn't rely on nonviolence. So these Christians then began to accept that there would be times when violence was necessary to punish injustice or to restore peace or to protect their communities. Still, they refused unnecessarily violence. In terms of the roles of women in the church, Christianity followed the patriarchal rule of Judaism, but women at least are considered children of God. They did not condemn slavery at this time. Lots of people had slaves around this time, but the Christians did teach that slaves were also children of God. The Christians increasingly start to identify people who do not share their beliefs as opponents or as demons. This would include Jews, from which, their religion sprang from. This would include Jews, pagans, and heretics, all of whom they identified with Satan. So this will be important later in history as we approach the Crusades. Remember, at this early stage in Christianity, Christians were willing to fight only if needed to protect their territory. As they began to see other groups as opponents, it kind of sets the stage for their willingness to go to war later. While most of the fathers of the early Christian church wrote in Greek, there were three that wrote in Latin: Jerome, Ambrose, and Augustine. Of these, St. Augustine of Hippo was the most important. When Romans blamed Christians for the attack on the empire by the Visigoths, the Christians wondered if they'd been wrong. But Augustine, in his work called The City of God, said that Rome's problems should not stress the Christians and that their main concern should be entering heaven, which couldn't be attacked or conquered. His distinction between the higher world of perfection that we would leave and the lower world of corruption that was here on earth continued throughout the Middle Ages. Augustine taught that wisdom did not come from intellect alone, that there had to be an element of faith guiding that wisdom. He did not, however, say that intellect was contradictory. Augustine's guidance shifted people from classical humanism, the focus on humanity, to focusing on God-centered society in which the fulfillment of God's will would become front and center. Stoics did not have a problem with Christianity. They could totally get on board with this idea of the inherent brotherhood of man. The stretch between classical humanism and Christianity wasn't that far either, because both focused on caring for people and caring about people. The difference, however, was that the classical worldview had no ultimate end or meaning, ultimately. There were cycles of prosperity and misery that just kind of went on and on. In the Christian worldview, however, there was this spiritual meaning and a purpose. People try to overcome original sin to the ultimate end of eternal happiness. Classicism taught that the highest authority was reason. Christianity teaches that the highest authority is God, who can be reached by faith, which is something intangible and difficult to find with reason. When the classical ideals were in decay, Christianity survived as a civilizing means following the collapse of Rome. And as we close out chapter 5, I will leave you with this map that shows the extent of Christianity over several hundred years so that you can see just how far it expanded throughout the Mediterranean and then later into the Germanic lands.